The young man couldn't understand what was happening. It felt as if he were separating from his own body. What was that noise? Maybe it was happening somewhere nearby? Why couldn't he focus on those sounds? It felt as if he were falling into a void. It seemed completely impossible. The young man decided not to think about it anymore, since he couldn't make sense of it anyway. The young man woke up and opened his eyes. He tried to figure out what time it was, although the question seemed pointless. The young man got up and left the forest hut. It was daylight outside. The young man yawned and stretched, as one usually does after sleeping. The young man did a few stretches and returned to the cabin. He decided to get dressed because it was still chilly outside. The boy understood. If he caught a cold, he could be in serious trouble. The young man's name was Yu. He used to attend high school and enjoy hiking, but now the situation had changed. He had been here for 2 days now, following a strange incident. Yu, having gotten dressed, continued his morning exercises. Now this was no longer a hike, but a real struggle for survival. Just the morning before, the young man had been absorbed in the noise and bustle of the crowd and was eagerly awaiting the weekend so he could go on a relaxing hike. Suddenly, he found himself in a world he had never seen before. The culprit was a truck that had suddenly appeared out of nowhere. Fortunately, after taking inventory of his backpack, he discovered that there were, after all, a few useful items inside. Among them were a towel, an aluminum lunchbox, a utility knife, and 2 bottles of mineral water. After searching for the trail for about 10 minutes, he found a water source. Some shrimp-like creatures lived in the stream. This meant the water was safe to drink. After tasting it, Yu noted that it tasted very good. Yu set up a simple trap, found an open spot, and built a small shelter there. Later, the young man returned to the stream and found prey in the trap. They were those very shrimp-like creatures with strange cylindrical shells. Some of them gave the young man a strange sense of unease, so he set them aside. The shells were so hard that even a stone couldn't break them. Yu simply wrapped them in leaves and then roasted them over the fire. After roasting, the shells became more brittle, and he managed to remove them. The meat of these creatures was very juicy and almost indistinguishable from the shrimp and crabs he was used to. It had a slightly sweet aftertaste. However, he couldn't get rid of the strong, fishy smell or the sand that crunched between his teeth. Yu cleaned the shrimp. At first, he didn't like the fact that he found something resembling roe inside. After taking a bite, he felt a discomfort characteristic of food poisoning. It turned out that his bad feeling was a reaction to the poison. Yu was surprised. Could it be that he had developed special abilities? The young man thought that there were many things in this world he still had to understand. He decided to begin his investigations today. Today, the protagonist planned to find a hill with beautiful views of the mountains. Finding a village would be absolutely wonderful. In any case, studying the environment wouldn't hurt for his future survival in this world. You saw some strange berries hanging from a tree. They were quite brightly colored. Were they edible? It was a bit risky, but our hero wasn't about to pass up the chance to try something delicious from another world. The young man was curious about what they tasted like. However, he felt a strange chill, and the berries fell from his hands. Yu had already experienced this sensation when he picked up the poisonous shrimp. It turned out he had the ability to sense whether food was poisoned or not. It seemed unbelievable. Nearby, the young man spotted some unremarkable fruits on a bush. In this case, Yu felt nothing. That meant he could try them. The traveler tasted the fruit and was surprised by its flavor. The texture was crunchy, like a nut, and the aroma was strong, like a mango. The aroma was indeed strong, but not as sweet as a mango's. It seemed like an incredible combination. If Yu could describe these sensations in words, he would say that it was extraordinarily delicious. The protagonist decided to take some of these berries with him as a supply. Although the young man was upset by what had happened, it all felt like a waking dream. Nature was beautiful. It seemed as though no human had ever set foot here. The area was full of unknown fruits, vegetables, mushrooms, and strange little animals. You saw a squirrel eating a nut, and he wanted to try one too. Not far from his feet, our hero spotted some mushrooms. He decided to take a few with him as well. In this world, there was something edible everywhere. The young man had developed an ability that helped him identify poison in food. Thanks to it, he could safely try anything unfamiliar. In survival conditions, this ability was like a Midas touch. It allowed him to turn the surrounding forest into a veritable supermarket, where fresh produce lay on the shelves as if waiting for a customer. However, the constant gathering was a bit tiring, as the young man had come a long way. At the edge of the cliff, Yu saw a strange plant with a fruit hanging from it. This fruit was very appealing to him. There was no strong scent, and besides, the boy had eaten plenty along the way, so he wasn't hungry. Why then did he want to eat this fruit so badly? Before the young man's brain could even begin to react, his body was already moving step by step toward the fruit tree at the edge of the cliff. It seemed strange. Should he stop? You live by the principle, don't risk your life for the sake of tasty treats. But it seemed to him that in this case he could reach the fruit without much trouble. If he pressed his whole body against the trunk, he could reach the fruit without any trouble. However, things didn't go according to plan. The protagonist lost his balance and fell from the tree. As he fell, the young man thought, could it be that his suffering wasn't over yet? After his death, Yu was reborn in this world, but he succumbed to the temptation of the fruit. He did something he had never done before, and now it seemed absurd to him. As he fell, Yu thought, if he assumed the right position, he might not die. But if he broke something, the outcome was easy to imagine without medical equipment. Lying on the ground, our hero realized that he didn't want to die after all. He was alive, and that was the main thing. His right arm ached a little. Now he needed to examine it. He could barely feel any pain, but why couldn't he even touch his arm? Yu looked at his hands and was surprised. What was going on? What were those red lights around them? Yu heard the sound of the impact, but felt no pain. It was like some kind of invisible protective shell. It seemed that this was the very reason he hadn't been hurt after the fall. But where did this ability come from? Yu thought, could he have created this shield himself? At some point, the lights around his body disappeared. Yu realized he had gained a new ability. It turned out he was like a video game character. Yu decided he shouldn't get his hopes up too soon. How was he supposed to activate this new skill now? He hoped that the activation wouldn't only trigger in critical situations, like it had on that cliff. You thought that to activate the skill, he needed to try to relax. The young man succeeded. Sparks appeared around his body again. Now he wanted to test just how durable this shell was. He struck the rock with all his might. He felt no pain. There were no injuries on his body, but a crack appeared on the rocky surface. You realized that the shell was much more useful than he had previously thought. The young man decided to call this ability a spell. The protagonist surmised that this ability was somehow connected to those strange shrimp. If we assume that the shell is a special ability possessed by shrimp, then it becomes clear why such a shell cannot be broken with a stone. After being roasted over a fire, the shells became more brittle because the cooked shrimp could no longer activate their ability. After that, the young man ate the shrimp meat and acquired a new ability. This explanation satisfied our hero. He saw a certain logic in it. Gaining new abilities through food is simply wonderful. Yu decided that now he would be able to truly enjoy this world. He would set off on an adventure in search of new flavors, trying every plant and every living creature. Perhaps he would even dare to try dragon meat. Yu began to consider himself a brave tongue. The mere thought of it filled the young man with boundless energy. After Yu had expended a great deal of energy trying to climb the mountain, he finally found himself at the summit. It was bright at the top of the mountain, and the view was much wider. Yu looked down, and everything around him seemed simply magnificent. He had never seen such beauty before, especially in an urban setting. Yu remembered that it had been a long time since he'd seen the horizon. The sunlight reflecting off the smooth surface of the sea was more beautiful and dazzling than any gemstone. No matter how beautiful and dense the forest might be, it couldn't compare to a landscape like this. Yu looked around and concluded that there wasn't a single trace of civilization here. Our hero wasn't disappointed by this. Perhaps he would find something on the other side of the mountain. Besides, he was quite capable of surviving on his own. The view here was simply breathtaking. Our hero felt a little lonely, but he didn't want to think about it. Better to eat something now. Yu took the fruit from that very tree out of his backpack. Although it had taken some effort, he had the fruit after all. The guy wondered if it would taste as good as it looked. Yakuyu took a bite of the fruit and felt a sharp, sour taste. No enticing aroma, no sweetness. It wasn't even a lemon, but some kind of concentrated acid. You thought he'd wasted too much effort and even put himself in danger just for the sake of a single cent. If a person wants to live comfortably in another world, they need not only food but also decent living conditions. A simple wooden spear for catching snakes and other creatures. A stone axe to harvest wood more efficiently. A woven basket to store things that don't fit in a backpack. Having finished with the tools, our hero gathered materials to make the hut more sturdy. He laid wood on the floor and covered it with moss, making the bed softer and more comfortable. After that, the young man built a drying rack so that the shelter would resemble a real house even more. You thought that if he didn't find other people in the future, he might have to consider building a more durable house. Over the next few days, the protagonist's adventure continued. The young man kept finding more and more fruits. Thanks to his spell skill, he could even gather items from extremely dangerous locations. You didn't gain a single new ability, even though he tried many new fruits. Maybe he just hadn't eaten enough, or were new abilities no longer available to him. However, a new problem arose after that. His stomach began to ache severely. Although the young man could identify edible items, he couldn't predict how his body would react to them. You decided he needed to pay more attention to food safety. It would be terrible if he couldn't stop vomiting or diarrhea at some point. A day later, the stomach pain subsided, and the young man returned to the tree to check it again. You placed his hand on the trunk and concluded that the weather didn't affect the tree. The bark remained somewhat oily and smooth all the time. If you look closely, the tree's roots extend all the way to the foot of the mountain. It's no wonder that some of the vines are so thin and practically impossible to hold on to. Creatures that aren't good at climbing rocks would likely be unable to climb back up if they fell. The tree uses the allure of its fruit to lure prey to the edge of the cliff, causing them to lose their balance. The organisms that fall down are the tree's primary source of nutrients. From above, the protagonist could see a multitude of bones lying below. If not for the spell he had received, he would have become another victim. However, good things were happening around this tree as well. You saw a rabbit running past. Using the weapon he had prepared, Yu was able to take down the rabbit. The young man, holding a blood-stained stone axe, said he had succeeded. If you don't bleed the animal immediately after killing it, the meat will develop an unpleasant odor. That's why it's important to do this in time, so the meat tastes better, and then gut the carcass before the internal organs start to rot. Yu unexpectedly discovered that he had acquired the charm of that fruit. This ability attracted various small animals, mostly herbivores, and they all became his food. His feelings were mixed, but the young man believed that he would finally be able to eat meat. He had to decide whether to boil it or fry it. It was a pity there was no salt. Suddenly, the young man heard a strange sound. Whose voice was that? It was a genuine scream of terror. You looked toward the treacherous tree. The young man became curious about what had happened here, and he looked down from the cliff. At the foot of the mountain, the protagonist saw a girl lying there. The young man wondered, should he help this person? Compassion got the better of him, and our hero carried the girl to his dwelling. Evening fell, and Yu was already preparing food for two. Sitting by the fire, our hero wondered why she still hadn't woken up. Yu, stirring the soup, thought that this was the first time he had seen such an unusual hair color as this girl's. A few hours earlier, Yu had gone down to the foot of the mountain, approached the girl, and asked if she was all right. There was no answer. He brought his fingers to the girl's nose and made sure she was breathing. That was a good sign. He didn't find any obvious head injuries, but there was an abrasion and a small swelling on her leg. It seemed that the stranger's life was not in danger. However, she could still have sustained serious injuries in the fall. You thought he couldn't just stand by. After all, if he didn't help the girl, she might die. The young man saw no other option. Yu hoisted the girl onto his shoulders and told her she would have to bear with it. He added that he would carry her to a safe place. You thought the sun had set long ago, but the girl still hadn't woken up. Was that normal? The stranger's clothes were quite simply adorned, but traces of civilization were evident. If she wasn't a time traveler, then there were people in this world after all. In that case, he could try asking for help in some settlement. You noticed that his stew had already come to a boil. However, the smell wasn't very pleasant. You understood that this was to be expected, but it still seemed unpleasant to him. You thought that, in any case, he should start by skimming off the foam that had formed on top with a spoon. You decided to add a little fennel and let it simmer for a few more minutes. Now the aroma was much better. It was a whole different story. You scooped up some soup with a spoon and decided to try it. The guy felt that the unpleasant smell hadn't completely disappeared, but it was still quite tasty. The dish wasn't perfect, but it combined many different ingredients. If you got used to it, the aroma would even seem appetizing. You picked a piece of meat from his plate and said that now it was time for the main course. It looks good. I wonder how it will taste. The protagonist tasted the fatty meat, a sweetness combined with the unique aroma of fennel. The unpleasant smell lingered, but it still tasted good. After all, it was real meat. Yu decided to eat another plate while the smell was still bearable. Suddenly, the boy saw a fiery beast emerge from the forest. Yu was surprised. Could this really be the burning wolf? The beast approached slowly. The burning wolf approached the fire and stopped. What was it up to? The beast began greedily devouring the tongues of flame leaping from the fire. Yu was glad that the beast didn't react to him at all. Yu was amazed. Could this wolf really feed on fire? Now there was almost nothing left of the fire. The wolf turned and headed back into the forest. Yu was surprised. Had the burning wolf simply walked away? The protagonist decided he was lucky. Apparently, humans weren't on this beast's list of favorite foods. Yu said that a wolf that feeds on fire is a sign of a completely different world. Suddenly, the stranger woke up and sat up on the makeshift bed. The girl clutched her head. Yu reacted and said that she had finally come to. The guy stepped closer and began to examine the girl closely. As expected, the girl was frightened and screamed loudly. Yu asked her to calm down, promising to explain everything. The young man covered the girl's mouth with his hand and said that if she attracted the attention of wild animals, they could get into serious trouble. Yu immediately assured her that he wouldn't hurt her, so she shouldn't be afraid of him. Still covering her mouth with his hand, the young man said he would wait until she had completely calmed down. After a while, the young people sat peacefully on opposite sides of the fire. Yu stirred the coals with a stick. The stranger frowned, her eyes downcast. A mark from the slap remained on the young man's cheek. Yu thought he understood the girl's fear. After all, if a stranger had covered his mouth deep in the forest, he would have been scared too. The protagonist wasn't angry, but he didn't know how to communicate with her because of the language barrier. Still, he really wanted to learn more about other worlds. Yu heard a rumbling coming from the stranger's stomach. The protagonist correctly concluded that she was hungry. Yu took the pot off the fire and thought that if he himself were injured and frightened, food would definitely help him calm down. Our hero filled a bowl with the soup and offered it to the girl. He said that the smell wasn't very pleasant, but the soup was nutritious and she absolutely needed to eat. Yu guessed that the girl didn't understand him, but he held out the bowl to her and gestured that she should try it. The stranger took the bowl of food, brought it to her lips, and took a small taste. After that, she ate every last bit. Yu figured the girl must have been incredibly hungry to eat with such an appetite. Yu thought that meeting someone in this world was a sign that fate hadn't forgotten him. The guy scratched the back of his head because he didn't know how to deal with the language barrier. It would be great if they could understand each other, just like in online novels. The stranger unexpectedly thanked the young man for the delicious food. Yu was surprised. Could she really be speaking his native language? Yu apologized to the girl since he didn't know she understood him. The girl said she had used language magic. The young man's language was very complex, so she might not always be able to express herself correctly. Yu was delighted and said he understood her perfectly. Our hero thought they wouldn't be able to communicate normally for a while. Could such spells really exist? Plus, this girl has a pleasant voice. It's very touching. The girl apologized for being scared of him, even though the young man had saved her. He replied that it was okay since he was a stranger to her. It's perfectly normal to be scared in a situation like that. The young man asked how her wounds were doing now. The stranger replied that she had used healing magic, but it would take about 3 weeks for everything to fully heal. The young man introduced himself and said his name was Yu. He also asked what the girl's name was. The stranger said her name was Kulala. Her parents had given her that name. Yu noticed that it was quite cold here and offered to help Kulala move closer to the fire. The girl thanked him. Yu asked why Kulala was here all alone. The girl explained that she had wanted to go into the mountains to gather medicinal herbs, but had gotten into trouble. She had gone without food for several days. When she could no longer bear it, she found a tree and couldn't resist the monster's temptation. Yu said that Kulala must have suffered a great deal. The young man thought that in this unusual world, people called strange plants and animals monsters. Kulala declared that if it weren't for her savior, she would have already perished. The girl thanked the young man once again. Yu replied that there was no need for thanks. The young man decided that it would be too much if Kulala continued to thank him in every sentence. Our hero said that now he was worried about what the two of them would do next. Yu pointed out that she was injured and offered to help carry her home. Kulala replied that it wouldn't work. Kulala added that her village was on the other side of the mountain. However, there were many terrifying monsters there. Yu decided that in that case, they couldn't act rashly. Even though he was familiar with the area, figuring out a route while carrying an injured person and the necessary supplies was quite problematic. If they took the other path the girl had come here on, it would take a long time. And if something happened, it would be difficult to handle the situation. You figured that Kulala had set aside 3 weeks for her recovery. Kulala thought she was just a waste of food and a burden to this guy. Kulala apologized and said she couldn't go. Couldn't the young man let her stay here a little longer? You said he didn't want anything to happen to them on the road, so they would stay here until the girl's leg healed. If she strained her leg, recovery would be more difficult. It would be great if someone could help them. Did Kulala have anyone in mind? The girl sighed deeply and said she didn't know anyone like that. Yu was surprised. Did Kulala really think he would leave her here? You said it would be better for the girl to stay here. The conditions weren't ideal, but she'd be able to recover. You guessed that the girl wanted to return as soon as possible because she felt uncomfortable being alone with him. The guy noted that he wouldn't stoop so low as to take advantage of a girl in trouble. You added that he hoped Kulala would recover soon, and then they would set off together. Kulala remarked that she couldn't help in any way and would only be a burden to the young man. You objected and said that wasn't true. He hadn't seen people in a very long time. Meeting her was a real stroke of luck. Besides, he was a real glutton, so her presence would teach him to plan his meals better. Kulala should feel comfortable here. Kulala burst into tears and thanked the young man. You asked if she would take him to her village once she recovered. The answer was yes. Night fell. The young people lay down in the hut with their backs turned to each other. You lay awake for a while. He thought the girl needed help, but she didn't want to be a burden to anyone. She was truly willing to sacrifice her own well-being. The protagonist wondered why she treated herself this way and who had made her this way. You decided he wanted to be with this girl, and with that thought in mind, he fell asleep. Ever since our hero had arrived in this world, he had been alone the whole time. Sometimes he felt uncomfortable, and he didn't know what to do. Kulala's appearance was like a fire lit in the darkness. You thought that he would no longer have to go through all of this alone. He needed to protect this fire. The young man decided that tomorrow would be a very difficult day. The next morning, our hero looked around. He decided he needed to find something edible. Now that there were 2 of them to feed, he needed to gather ingredients to last. He needed fruits, vegetables, mushrooms, roots, and nuts. Although edibility was the primary criterion for gathering, the young man still wanted to try new flavors. He spotted fruits he had never seen before. Yu wondered why he hadn't seen these fruits before. Although they hung high up, they still looked edible. Yu stretched and decided to give them a try. The young man jumped high into the air. The attempt was successful. The fruit ended up in his hand. Our hero figured he was getting stronger every day. Maybe it was because of the delicious food. This fruit also turned out to be delicious and somewhat resembled an apple, but it wasn't as sweet. Under the tree, Yu saw a plant he hadn't noticed before. It had a rare and rich color. Yu plucked a leaf and sniffed it. The scent was slightly tart. He didn't get a bad feeling, so the leaves must be edible. He bit off the edge of the leaf and noted that it tasted pretty good. A fresh aroma and a light sweetness filled his taste buds. After that, his fatigue vanished as if by magic. Perhaps Kulala would like it too, so the young man gathered a large amount of the plant. Yu picked a bunch of the plant and decided that would be enough. All that was left was to wrap everything up neatly. The protagonist was recharged with energy, so now he could explore a few more places. The boy found quite a few ingredients, so they'll try cooking some new dishes. However, there was one very important ingredient he still hadn't found. After a while in a small ravine, the young man saw something truly impressive. Its color and shape immediately caught his interest. Yu climbed down into the ravine, picked up the rock and licked it. It really was rock salt. You thought, finally he had found the most important ingredient. Finding salt by the sea is no problem, but finding it in the mountains is a real stroke of luck. The young man decided that from now on, their food would taste even better. Yu decided to take a little rock salt with him and come back later for more. The boy noticed some small black dots that were also moving. Yu walked closer and saw that they were mollusks. But why were they on the rock salt? Usually mollusks on land dehydrate and die. However, these were alive. The protagonist couldn't understand the anatomy of the creatures from this world. Yu decided they must be edible. He should put them in a lunchbox so they wouldn't rattle around in his backpack. Our hero hadn't expected today's trip to the forest to be so fruitful. Tonight's dinner would be a feast. Yu greeted the girl and said he was back. Kulala greeted him in return. You thanked Kulala for looking after the house. The young man was pleased when someone greeted him. The guy said he'd found a lot of tasty things, so dinner tonight would be excellent. The girl looked at the supplies and was surprised. Is all of this really edible? The young man replied that he didn't know how, but he'd developed the ability to tell what was edible and what wasn't. Kulala said that was amazing and asked what it was. Yu was surprised. Was something wrong? Kulala became interested in the plant. We replied that the leaves were delicious, a little sour, but they had a pleasant aroma. Kulala was surprised and said she had never tried them. It's a magical plant and it's very valuable. The young man hadn't expected such a reaction. After all, he had gathered a lot of plants. Kulala said that this would be enough for one family for at least 6 months. You said that in his world, the average cost for a family was 10,000. Here there were only about 10 leaves. So does one cost a whole 1,000? Why are they so expensive? Kulala noted that this was a good question. As she had said, the plant contained magical particles. A magical particle is an element of magical power. Consuming such particles helps speed up the restoration of magical abilities. That is precisely why the magical herb is an important ingredient for mages. A restorative decoction is prepared from it. However, there is a poisonous weed that looks very similar to this plant. The magical herb changes color when it senses magical power. Moreover, it is a very rare plant. Finding such a quantity is simply unimaginable. Our hero didn't think the plant would turn out to be so rare. Kulala said that the plant changes color to remain unnoticed. Could this plant be a chameleon? Will he gain that ability when he eats it? He realized that they had a rare opportunity, so Kulala should eat this leaf to regain her strength. The girl was at a loss because the plant was very precious. Should she really eat it? You told Kulala to stop putting herself down. Even though he didn't know why she spoke of herself that way, he was very glad she was here. Thanks to her, he had learned things he would never have thought of. He was happy to live here with her. The boy asked the girl not to say anything bad about herself. Kulala promised. The young man told Kulala to just eat the plant since it really is delicious. The girl agreed and said she would try it. Kulala's eyes widened and she declared that it was indeed very tasty. The leaves were crisp and juicy, and a refreshing, light dizziness enveloped her. The girl had never tasted anything like it before. You thought that if he, a man who had tasted so many things in his life, was impressed by the flavor, her reaction was not surprising. Kulala asked if she could eat a little more of the plant. The answer was yes. The young man added that it was time to start on dinner. He suggested making something interesting out of this herb. First, they needed to gather perishable ingredients. They decided to start with the mollusks. But how should they cook them? Kulala said they call them salt clams. You asked what they usually cook them with. The girl noted that these clams are also found near her village. They're usually used as a side dish. They're cooked over a fire right in their shells. They're salty, so no seasoning is needed, though some people dip them in fish sauce. There are also those who eat the clams raw, but then an upset stomach is sure to follow. Yu replied that he understood. Fish sauce is a fairly ancient condiment. Fish or shrimp are soaked in salt water. Enzymes contained in the fish's organs are used to break down the protein. After a few months, the fermentation process ends, and the sauce is filtered. You thought that the fish sauce the girl had mentioned was similar to the one prepared in his world. They needed to sharpen a few skewers. Yu asked the girl to do it. The guy said they'd be having skewers today. Kulala really wanted to help, so she was interested in preparing the skewers. The young man washed the ingredients and chopped everything up, including some fruit that looked like bananas. Now it was time to cook everything over the campfire. After that, everything was threaded onto wooden skewers. To make cooking easier, the boy slightly altered the design of the fire and used a stone to prevent anything from burning. Then the young man rekindled the fire, put water on it, and waited for it to boil. He placed the scallops on a stone slab and constantly turned the skewers, seasoning them to taste. The cook added mushrooms and other ingredients to the boiling water. When the stew was almost ready, the protagonist added a little salt. The full meal was ready. The girl was offered mushroom soup, lightly salted scallops, an assortment of skewers, and roasted sweet potatoes. Kulala said it was simply incredible. Yu agreed that the aroma was truly magnificent. The young man suggested starting the meal with soup to whet her appetite. Kulala thanked him and remarked that her appetite was already ravenous. The girl took a taste and said it had a unique mushroom flavor that paired perfectly with the vegetable broth. You said the kebab smelled simply wonderful. I wonder how it will taste. The young man tasted the meat and admitted that it was very tasty indeed. Even though the only seasoning was salt, the sweet pepper added an interesting sweetness and texture. Our hero had the highest expectations for the clams. I wonder what they'll taste like. Kalala said she hadn't eaten anything like this in a long time. To get the clams, you need to insert a twig into the shell and twist it slightly to remove the meat. The firm clam meat yields easily to the teeth. The flavor makes you reach for the next clam. Kalala noticed that there was still broth left in these shells. The firm clam meat, combined with the thick broth, reveals a completely different flavor. The young people agreed. The meal was delicious. After the meal, Yu said he was full. Kulala noted that the sweet potatoes were also excellent, soft and sweet. The young man's culinary skills deserved praise. Yu handed the girl a precious leaf and said it was dessert. Kulala was delighted. The protagonist guessed that the girl really liked the plant. Yu remarked that it would be great if they could make syrup from this plant. If they added fruit, it would make jam. It was definitely worth a try. The young man realized it would be a waste, but it sounded delicious. The price of a jar of such jam would be sky high. You thought that in his own world, he spent too much time thinking about food? This sometimes annoyed those around him. Probably it's exactly the same in this world. They were able to communicate thanks to Kalala's magic. If they went to her home, wouldn't there be problems due to cultural differences? The protagonist asked his companion to tell him more about this world. The young man also asked if she found this request strange. Kalala admitted that she didn't often hear such requests, but she didn't find it strange. Besides, she loved telling stories. The girl added that she would be happy to help the young man broaden his horizons. Yu thought that the girl hadn't asked any questions and had simply accepted his request. The young man said that in that case, he was counting on Kulala as his teacher. The girl was surprised. Could she really be called a teacher? Yu told Kulala not to be modest. The young man promised to be a diligent student. Kulala promised to help and figure everything out. By the third day of their acquaintance, Yu was already able to distinguish between different types of magic. Kulala noticed that this student was a quick learner. He was a true genius. The young man was glad to hear that. Yu admitted that he wasn't very good at absorbing the material, but Kulala explained things very clearly. Kulala noticed that it was also becoming easier for her to understand the young man's language. Although she didn't understand every word, the context made it much easier. Yu admitted that this was simply wonderful. Our hero assumed that this teaching method would help them avoid potential cultural conflicts in the future. Kulala opened her heart to him and seemed to cheer up. She began to smile more often. Yu noticed that healing magic drained her energy, just like translation magic. Wouldn't it make more sense to save her energy for healing? Kulala pointed out that there was nothing to worry about. Translation merely slightly organized his words in her mind, so it consumed almost no magical energy. At first, healing consumed a lot of magic, but after eating, her strength was restored. You said he was very happy. The young man didn't fully understand the principle of magic, but he was glad she was managing. Healing magic is the equivalent of the medical profession in his world. But doctors can't always save a dying person, unlike a mage, whose power is always with them. A 30-year-old mage is capable of instantly healing only minor wounds requiring a few stitches. More severe injuries require several weeks for complete healing. It turns out that Kulala's healing technique is of a fairly high level. The protagonist concluded that Kulala is a powerful mage. The girl said that it's not just herbs that can manifest magical power. All foods in this world are capable of it to one degree or another. Although the amount of magical elements in them varies, consuming them still helps. Yu stated that he had already experienced this himself. He felt his body becoming stronger and more energetic. It seemed to be related to food. The young man thought that the fact that one could become stronger through food should be kept secret from the others. Kalala drew the young man's attention to the fact that a wild beast had emerged onto the clearing. Kalala said that it was Derek, a ferocious beast, the king of the mountain. He had attacked many hunters. The wild beast took the form of a huge horned deer. Yu decided it would not be an exaggeration to say, unlike a wolf, this beast had decided to attack them. They wouldn't be able to defeat it, but they could try to run away. However, the young man remembered that Kulala couldn't run right now. Yu grabbed a stone axe and thought, even if he could carry the girl, there was no way they could outrun the beast. But he couldn't leave her behind. The protagonist turned around and began to run. Kulala was surprised. The young man shouted for the beast to chase after him. The next moment, the deer turned and charged after the young man. Our hero was scared, but he couldn't run away and leave Kalala alone. However, he didn't know what to do next. Maybe he should try to activate the spell? Yu jumped sharply to the side and the deer raced past him. Under the effect of the acceleration, the young man kept moving for a while longer, causing him to tumble over several times. Yu declared that he had succeeded. He could see even the slightest movements in the area, so tracking the beast's intentions would be no trouble. However, the real battle had only just begun. Despite the beast's strength, the young man decided he could stand up to it if he concentrated. It's one thing to run away, but winning is quite another. The beast looks as if it's consumed by rage. Its horns gleam strangely. Maybe it has some special abilities. Yu saw that the beast was preparing to attack. It was about to charge into battle. The antagonist managed to dodge, and the stag raced past, leaving trails of dust in its wake. The young man decided that he had succeeded. Now he needed to try to hide. However, with such a powerful strike, it wouldn't be easy to defend himself. Our hero noticed that the deer was breathing deeply and turning its head from side to side. Kulala told the young man to be careful. The beast is gathering energy from outside. Yu was surprised. What was the girl talking about? The deer gathered the necessary energy, mustered its strength, and charged at the young man once more. The protagonist noticed that the deer had become 3 times faster. Our hero realized it was too late to run. The young man jumped high into the air, and the deer raced past him. As he landed, the young man thought that had been dangerous. The body starts moving faster than the brain can react. He realized it was too early to celebrate. The beast would soon turn around and come back. Was there any way to limit its movements? Yu looked at the trees, but they seemed too thin to him. They might shatter into pieces. The rocks weren't tall enough. It would be too easy to jump over them. The young man's gaze fell on a tree, and he decided it would do. If the beast got its horns stuck in the trunk, it wouldn't be able to get free. Yu decided he needed to lure the beast so it would run into the tree at full speed. Our hero stood with his back to the huge tree and began to provoke the beast toward him. He gestured wildly and shouted loudly. The deer lowered its head forward, thrust out its antlers, and charged at the young man. Yu thought he needed to make sure the antlers hit the trunk exactly. At the right moment, our hero jumped aside, and the deer's antlers plunged into the tree trunk. The protagonist realized he had succeeded. Now the beast couldn't move. Its movements were restricted. Using a homemade stone axe, the protagonist swung and struck the beast on the head. The axe couldn't take the impact and broke into pieces. It simply shattered. The young man knew the beast was about to break free. The tree wouldn't hold it. Was this really the end? Suddenly, a sword plunged into the ground in front of the young man. A voice shouted for him to hold on tighter. The young man didn't know who the voice or the sword belonged to, but the weapon was suitable for fighting the beast. The beast freed its horns, hooked the boy, and tossed him high into the air. Yu hit his back against a tree, but he didn't let go of the sword. The young man fell to the ground, his back aching badly. The protagonist got to his feet. He still had his weapon, so he had to fight back. The beast prepared to attack again. Our hero had to make a decision: attack, defend, or run. The young man shouted that he wouldn't give the beast a single chance and struck, gripping the sword firmly with both hands. The protagonist emerged victorious. The powerful beast was slain. Exhausted, the young man sank to his knees and leaned his hands on his sword. He said he had succeeded. The young man was glad to be alive. He felt sorry for killing the animal, but the beast had been extremely ferocious. Yu calmed down and wondered who owned this sword. Without it, he certainly wouldn't have managed. He and Kalala could have ended up as dinner for a deer. The sword's owner turned out to be a girl dressed as a nun. The outfit was elegant and didn't fit the clothing of the people living in these mountains at all. The girl looked young. Maybe she was a schoolgirl? The protagonist greeted her and wondered, where did this girl, the owner of the sword, come from? Suddenly, the girl's legs gave way and she fell. Yu was surprised. What was going on here? Yu ran over and asked if she was okay. Why did she suddenly fall? The stranger replied that she was dying of hunger. The protagonist realized that the girl had lost consciousness. She was definitely not okay. Our hero couldn't just leave her alone. Kalala asked if Yu was okay. She was too far away to see what was happening. The young man replied that he was fine. A kind girl had thrown him her sword. Thanks to that, he was able to stay alive. Yu added that the sword's owner was temporarily unconscious. Leaning on her staff, Kalala approached and asked what had happened to the girl. Yu suggested that the stranger had fainted from hunger. She needed to rest and then eat a hearty meal. The protagonist warned that he would now be preparing the venison. If Kalala wanted to go to sleep, she didn't have to wait for him. Kalala said he had just been fighting and nearly died. He himself needed to rest. It was very dark now. It wasn't worth the risk. Kalala noticed that it had happened again. If she could run, the young man wouldn't have to risk his life. The girl added that she was completely useless. You asked Kalala not to say that anymore. They had survived, and that was the main thing. Our hero added that now, with a weapon that even the king of the mountain couldn't withstand, no beast could scare him. There was no need to worry. If they didn't deal with the meat quickly, it would simply spoil. They couldn't lose such a precious source of energy. The young man promised he wouldn't go far. If anything happened, Kalala could just call out to him. The protagonist decided there was nothing to worry about, but he would keep the spell active for now. Our hero noticed that his sight and hearing had become much sharper than on his first day here. Nevertheless, there was no guarantee that he would be able to recognize danger immediately. Processing such a huge carcass isn't easy. Even draining the blood is a difficult task. Skinning it and cutting the meat off also proved difficult. Drawing on his previous experience, the young man tried to cut off as much meat as possible. The sword significantly sped up the process. However, using the sword as a cleaver was too rough. It needs to be cleaned before returning it to its owner. The amount of meat from the deer carcass turned out to be so great that even the three of them couldn't eat it all. The young man decided to divide the meat into two parts, one to keep as a reserve, the other for tonight's dinner. The meat from the thighs is undoubtedly the most appealing, so it was decided to cook that. Since the pieces were quite large, they needed to be cut to ensure even cooking and an even distribution of salt. You decided to tweak the poor man's chicken recipe a bit and layer the meat with a mushroom and vegetable filling to make the flavor more interesting. Then he wrapped the meat in aromatic leaves to retain moisture. To prevent the meat from burning, he mixed a little clay with water and applied it on top as a protective coating. Our hero made a small depression, placed the meat in it, and covered it with firewood so that it would cook evenly on all sides, and baked it for about 4 hours. You track the time by the position of the moon. In 12 hours, the moon moves from east to west at an average speed of 15 degrees per hour. This allowed him to keep track of time. In addition, he placed a grill on a stone slab, laid out the lightly salted pieces of meat on it, covered them with leaves, and slowly evaporated the moisture over low heat. The young man was very hungry because of the aroma of the meat, but he didn't want to eat alone. For the rest of the time, the protagonist continued to simmer the meat as there was a great deal of it. You decided that when the girls woke up, they would be able to eat their fill, and their fear and fatigue would subside. Suddenly, he himself fell asleep unexpectedly. At some point, the young man came to. Someone was shaking his shoulder and telling him it was time to wake up. You was surprised. Had he really fallen asleep? But what about the meat? Lifting the leaves, our hero realized that the meat was fine. It hadn't burned. Judging by the position of the moon, now was the right time to take the meat off the fire. Kalala asked if you wanted to sleep a little longer. You replied that he was fine. He'd taken a nap and now felt great. Kalala looked into the fire and asked what those clay dumplings were. You smiled and replied that they weren't dumplings at all. He'd show her everything right now. The young man broke open the clay and removed the leaves, but they turned out to be hot. Kalala saw the meat and said it looked very appetizing. It was a roasted deer leg. The girl hadn't expected to find such meat inside the clay. You noticed that the halves of this clay structure could be used as dishes once they cooled down. The young man asked if the girl in the monk's robes had woken up yet. Kalala said that she had actually woken the young man up because of her. She wanted you to help her wake up. Perhaps she was injured. A repeated that the girl had fainted from hunger, but she should wake up when she smells the meat. Kalala assured him that the girl would be fine. They had plenty of food so she could eat as much as she wanted. The young people sat down across from each other and wished each other bon appetit. As expected, the meat was beyond praise. It was so juicy that it was impossible to stop eating. The protagonist thought it was delicious. There was no unpleasant smell, and the leaves added a slight sweetness to the meat. Kalala noted the range of flavors that made you want to keep eating even when you were already full. The taste grew stronger with every bite. The young man thought that the thin layers of fat seemed to fill his stomach and made the meat taste magical. Kalala noted that the mushrooms, having soaked up the meat juices, had become even tastier and more filling than before. The girl admitted that it was incredibly delicious. It was the first time she had ever eaten something so amazing. Yu said he had the same thoughts. He was even ashamed to call what he had eaten before meat. The meat tasted a bit like beef, but even the finest beef couldn't compare to venison. However, there was something about this dish that struck the guy as odd. It was strange that the meat of such a ferocious beast turned out to be so tender. Usually the meat of muscular animals is tough and not very tasty. Kulala reminded him of what she had said earlier. Magic is the source of everything in this world. It's something like life force. Our hero decided that he would never understand this world using common sense alone. Completely unique rules and laws govern this place. Besides, the stronger a person is, the lower the risk of becoming someone's victim. You said that now he understood everything, and thanked Kulala. The girl was glad she had helped him. You thought, the stronger the beast, the tastier it is. He had never heard anything more romantic in his life. Now he eagerly awaits the adventures to come. The owner of the sword woke up, got to her feet, and said she could smell meat. Where was it? Kulala was startled by such insistence. The stranger apologized and asked if she could have a piece of meat. Kulala treated the girl to a piece of fragrant meat. The stranger thought it was incredible. The taste was simply magical. However, this was no time to give in to temptation. The girl apologized for her rudeness. It was inappropriate to beg for food from her saviors. She couldn't kneel, so this was the only way she could thank them. You told the girl not to say that since she had helped him. Without her sword, he wouldn't have won, so he should be thanking her. The stranger noted that the young man had talent. You thought that her personality didn't match her appearance. You told the girl not to stand around idly. She could tell him about herself over dinner. Kulala noted that there was enough food for everyone. The stranger said the food was delicious. She hadn't thought it was possible to cook such a meal in the mountains. The young man really was a genius. You noted that they had a limited supply of seasonings, so he simply added a little salt during the cooking process. Kulala told you not to be modest. The amount of salt was perfect, the side dish went wonderfully with the meat, and the texture was tender. It was impossible to stop eating. The stranger added that the cooking temperature was also perfect. She hadn't even encountered anything like this in restaurants. You thought these were very high praises and was glad the girls liked everything. The stranger realized she hadn't even introduced herself. The girl said her name was Cartier Froya, and she was a knight of the temple. Kulala and you were surprised. Could it really be a knight of the temple standing before them? The young man thought it sounded simply unbelievable. The very fact that she had ended up deep in the forest and hadn't starved to death seemed very strange. Cartier apologized and said it was all right. After all, they had saved her, so they were allowed to do anything. The girl explained that knights of the temple are people who serve the gods and help others. They enjoy the unconditional trust of those around them. Cartier added that, of course, she'd be happy to tell them about herself. But how was it that they didn't know about the knights of the temple? That seems strange. You explained that he was born far from here, so he knows little about this place. Cartier believed him, since the young man's clothes looked unique. But those were just details. Kulala said she had a question for Cartier. The knight of the temple noted that she still didn't know this girl's name, even though she already considered her a friend. Kulala noted that the question might seem tactless, but how old was Cartier? Kulala added that she'd heard you could only become a knight of the temple after turning 18. Cartier admitted that you can indeed only apply after turning 18. She's already 19, but people still don't believe she's a knight. Kulala apologized. Cartier said she was used to it, since she really did look younger. You suggested that this was a sensitive topic for Cartier. The knight said she was already used to people looking down on her. He remarked that judging a book by its cover was foolish. Cartier wasn't to blame for anything. Once they got to know each other better, the prejudices would disappear on their own. The protagonist remembered that he hadn't introduced himself, so he gave his name as well. Kulala also gave her name and said she was glad to meet them. Cartier thanked them for telling her the names of her rescuers. You advised her to drop the excessive politeness. The young man was happy to meet new friends here and asked what Cartier had been doing here all alone. Cartier admitted that something had indeed happened here, and she had been sent to investigate. The girl noted that she couldn't tell outsiders about secret missions. However, after what had happened, she was ready to make an exception. She asked the young people not to panic, even though people were saying they'd seen a dragon here. You was frightened and wondered how Cartier was going to deal with such a beast. Dragons are always depicted in different ways. Sometimes it's a monster that kidnaps princesses. Sometimes it's one that has awakened from a long slumber and decided to conquer the world. Its existence is always frightening. Cartier said it was just a rumor that a dragon-like creature had been spotted nearby. Perhaps the investigation simply wouldn't confirm it. Kulala remarked that if the dragon really exists, a lot of knights will soon gather on the mountain. Cartier noted that her task was to verify the credibility of the witnesses' statements. She didn't think she might face any danger, especially hunger. The girl admitted that she was actually a city kid with no survival skills. She couldn't find the right path, didn't know what was edible, and was simply wandering through unfamiliar terrain. Yu asked what Cartier planned to do next. The girl replied that she saw no point in continuing the investigation, but she couldn't abandon the mission either. Yu suggested that the Templars stay at their camp for a short while. The young man noted that she needed the camp to continue her mission. She wouldn't have to worry about food now. Besides, her sword had already been helpful and could certainly help with future dangers. Cartier thought that if anyone else got eaten, it would be a problem. You told her not to worry. They had enough supplies. Besides, the Knights Templar protect people, so she'll help them. Cartier said she understood. The young people shook hands. The knight said she would stay here for a while to look after her new friends. The young people walked down to the sea. It was a joyful occasion. You thought they should have come here sooner, even though finding the salt had put their search for the new one on hold for a bit. Cartier said the boy looked excited. Did he like the sea that much? The young man remarked that he liked the sea creatures more than the sea itself. However, the sea really is beautiful. It would be great if Kalala were here with them. They need to get back as soon as possible so that nothing bad happens to Kalala. Our hero began to take off his shoes. The young man decided that he needed to catch a fish as soon as possible, and a big one at that. The water was a little cold. However, fishing in the shallow water wasn't difficult. Besides fish, he could also look for crabs and shrimp. You thought that if he looked hard enough, he might even find some shellfish. Cartier said that this place was like the Arctic Circle. The young man asked, "Is the Arctic Circle what you were talking about yesterday?" The girl explained that the polar circle is a region unsuitable for human habitation. These can be areas with extreme cold, heat, humidity, or drought. Cartier thought, how could a resident of this country not know about the polar circle? The monsters living beyond the Arctic Circle are dangerous because they've adapted to the harsh conditions. The dragon she's looking for lived there too. The Knights of the Temple are tasked with hunting monsters that escape from beyond the Arctic Circle. You thought that this didn't seem like what he considered the Arctic Circle on Earth. Could there really be so many monsters there? That meant there was plenty of delicious food. Cartier admitted that there really were a lot of delicious monsters there. Hunters of delicacies often perish on such expeditions, and that worried them too. The protagonists thought that the more different kinds of monsters there were, the richer their diet would be. Cartier didn't understand why he asked that, but even knights are forbidden from venturing into such a dangerous place on a whim. The only exception is a mission to search for a missing person. She had gone on such a mission several times. Cartier thought she didn't want to go back there anymore. The protagonist believed that if there was a chance, one should see everything. The girl noticed that she liked the local scenery. However, even in such a beautiful place, terrible things can happen, and something like that had already happened to her. You admitted that the mountains were indeed dangerous, but once you'd experienced their danger, it wouldn't be easy to be scared by anything else. Cartier said she was ready to start. The young man liked her attitude. The girl took off her clothes and was left in a swimsuit. Noticing the young man's gaze, Cartier asked, "Is something wrong?" You thought, even though she's a knight of the temple, she's still a girl. His interactions with the opposite sex had so far been limited to simple conversation. Apparently, she doesn't understand anything. He blushed with embarrassment and covered his eyes with his hand. The young man thought this was inappropriate. However, in any case, he needed to calm down. The tension had to subside. Cartier realized something was off and blushed with embarrassment as well. Yu stepped into the water and said he was ready to begin. The protagonist, still feeling embarrassed, decided he couldn't let himself get distracted. He needed to follow her quickly. The young man dove underwater and realized that the cold water would instantly calm his mind. He needed to dive deeper. The seabed was unique. A little sunlight filtered into the shallow water, making it look like a precious sapphire. You knew that if there were schools of fish nearby, there was nothing to fear. In shape, they differed little from fish on Earth. They were slightly redder and had more fins, but they didn't look strange at all. The diver spotted a plump fish that looked quite appetizing. He could catch it with a spear, but ideally it would be better to keep the carcass intact. Instinctively, the young man clutched his ears. What was happening? That strange sound was about to burst his eardrums. Yu decided he had to get out of there and began swimming vigorously toward the surface. The protagonist broke the surface and began breathing heavily. What kind of fish was that? His ears were still ringing, but his hearing seemed to be fine. Cartier surfaced too and asked if he'd heard any noise. Was everything okay? Yu replied that he was fine. The young man said he had found the fish, but hadn't expected it to make such a piercing sound. The girl realized which fish he was talking about. Cartier explained that when this fish senses danger, it sucks in water, expanding its body, and then makes a loud sound to scare off predators. The young man didn't think such a fish could exist. However, he guessed that it might be very tasty. The protagonist regretted that the fish had swum away, but decided to catch another one. The girl asked the boy to be careful. You thought that the more he learned about this world, the more delicious food he would be able to try. Our hero took a deep breath and dove underwater again. The protagonist decided to look for a fish that looked like it could be caught with his bare hands. Right ahead, our hero spotted a fish that caught his interest. Its color was quite ordinary, but its head looked as if it had been hit. You decided the fish looked funny. It probably wouldn't be hard to catch. The protagonist decided not to think about it anymore. He had just missed one catch, so he couldn't afford to miss this time. The fish sensed danger and began to secrete something. You was startled. What kind of poison was this? Some kind of bodily fluid. However, if it had been poison, he would have realized it immediately. The protagonist realized they were bubbles. The fish was releasing tiny bubbles as a disguise. After that, it tried to swim away. However, our hero had other plans, and he threw his harpoon, piercing the fish's body right through. Yu was glad he'd succeeded. He'd always wanted to try spearfishing. He was running out of oxygen. Yu decided he needed to get to the surface quickly. He just had to retrieve his catch. After a while, the young man told Kulala that they were back. Cartier also said hello. Kulala was delighted when she saw that Cartier and Yu had returned. The girl added that she had been worried because they were late. Yu noted that he hadn't caught any big fish, but he'd managed to get something for dinner. Cartier told Kulala to take a look at their catch. There were fish in the basket. Kulala looked into the basket and said it was a baboon, plus 3 of them. That's really cool. Kulala noted that the fish tasted a little bland, but if grilled, it would be very tasty. It's very skittish and can release tiny bubbles to hide from danger. Catching this fish is quite difficult. Yu asked if there was another way to cook this fish. Kulala remembered hearing something about it. If you fry it in oil, it loses its unique flavor. However, if you simmer it over low heat, it should turn out delicious. Yu decided to take a chance and give it a try. Kulala asked what the young man had in mind. His last recipe had been delicious. She was sure it would turn out well this time too. Yu said that first he would clean the fish and ask Cartier for her knife. The girl expressed a desire to go with him. Cartier admitted that the young man's skillful technique was no different from that of a first-class chef. Yu noted that there was nothing complicated about it. You just had to memorize the steps and practice. It seemed strange to our hero that he was being praised so much for simply cleaning a fish. After a while, the protagonist had almost finished with the scales. Now the fish needed to be gutted. Inside, it might differ from earthfish. The gills turned out to be too large. Perhaps that was why the fish could release bubbles. Each gill had pores through which the bubbles were formed. After frying, the fish becomes unpalatable because the pores absorb the oil. Looking at the gills, the girl said they looked disgusting. Yu said he was almost done cleaning the fish. We need to cook the fish while the ingredients are still fresh. A short while later, the fish fillets were ready. Cartier was surprised. Had the young man really filleted 2 whole fish that quickly? He tied the skin together and removed the bones. Yu said that now only the smallest one remained. However, this fish gave him a bad feeling. You thought that since everything had gone smoothly so far, this fish definitely wasn't poisonous. The protagonist decided that he should first cut open the fish's belly. Then the young man looked inside and was horrified. There were many parasites inside this fish. It seems that such things happen in this world. Cartier asked in surprise, "What is that?" The girl said she didn't like that kind of fish. I replied that there was nothing to worry about. They would simply remove the inedible parts. Cartier said she understood. She wasn't very good at cooking. However, if the young man said so, then everything was fine, and she felt relieved. You thought that since this was the first time the girl had caught something herself, even parasites weren't the best idea. However, Cartier also sensed something unusual about this fish. Could this be some kind of knight's ability? A peculiar sensitivity to danger. The protagonist thought that when eating meat, parasites were an unavoidable thing. Yu asked the girl to bring him a basket from their camp. Cartier agreed, since she could finally be of some use. Our hero was almost done with the fish. He couldn't wait to start cooking. To start, the young man removed the bones and finally chopped the fillet. After that, he tenderized it a bit to make the mince more elastic and the fish patties tastier. Since our hero didn't have any starch, he had to mash some potatoes. Next, he needed to chop the wild ginger and onions he'd found on his last outing. Then he had to mix the fish, potatoes, onions, and ginger, crack a couple of eggs, add salt, and stir until smooth. After a while, the young man finished this task, so it was time to move on to the next step. You set aside a few more pieces to try a different cooking method. Will everything turn out okay? After a while, the young man approached the girls and asked if the water had come to a boil. Cartier replied that it was just in time. Kulala said that the young man was, as always, doing a great job. You said that now they could start making the fish meatball soup. Cartier asked how he was going to make them. It was the first time she'd heard of this dish, but she could see how it would be prepared. I replied that he didn't have all the necessary ingredients, so he tried to find the closest substitutes. Fortunately, it looked pretty good. The only thing was, the soup had to be eaten right away so the meatballs wouldn't fall apart. Yu said that while the soup was coming to a boil, they could try his new recipe. Kulala was surprised. Had he really managed to prepare something else in such a short time? Cartier said she wanted to see. The young man presented the girls with seafood delicacies with white sauce. It was his own recipe. The girls looked at the dish and assumed it wasn't ready yet. Yu was surprised. How could it not be ready? Cartier was surprised. Can you really eat it raw? Kulala noted that it might cause diarrhea. The young man said he wanted to clarify something. Our hero decided that the girls might indeed misunderstand the situation, given the context of the time they were in. He would have to make an effort to convince them otherwise. The young man apologized and noted that he hadn't taken cultural differences into account. In that case, he would eat it himself, and the girls would have the soup. Kulala asked, "Could this really go without consequences?" Yu assured the girl that there was no need to worry, since he had carefully selected this particular fish. Yu brought a piece of raw fish to his mouth. The girls shouted in unison for him to stop. However, our hero put it in his mouth. Horror appeared in the girl's eyes. Yu said it was very tasty. The young man thought that the citrus aroma perfectly masked the fish's sea smell. Moreover, he detected an umami flavor in the fish, reminiscent of sea bream, with a slightly sweet aftertaste. This flavor was on a completely different level. He remarked that it was truly delicious and nutritious. The young man invited the girls to try it for themselves. Cartier and Kulala exchanged glances and decided that this guy could be trusted. The girls tasted the dish at the same time and were pleased. Looking at the expressions on their faces, the young man decided that they spoke for themselves. Kulala remarked that it was the perfect combination of salty and sweet, with a very rich flavor. Cartier noted that there was no fishy smell, just a very pleasant aroma. Kulala didn't think raw fish could be so delicious. How did the young man do it? She hadn't eaten raw fish even when she was very hungry. Waka replied that he had made a sauce using the citrus fruits he had found earlier. Thanks to it, the fishy smell is masked and the flavor becomes much fresher. Cartier said it was simply amazing. Yu was able to pick the perfect ingredients after just one try. Yu suggested that it was because he was trying something new. In such cases, he always thinks about which ingredients would go well with the dish. The young man added that he likes it when his food brings joy to others. The young man noticed that the fish meatball soup was ready too. Now it could be served into bowls. The dish looked pretty good. Yu warned that the soup was still very hot. Kulala remembered that the young man had once mentioned the word nutritious. What was that? He replied that it was something like elements that restore magic. When you're tired, nutritious food helps you recover. The protagonist added that he wanted to tell the girls a story. In the bitter cold, the expedition members found themselves in danger. The only food they had was sea fish living under a thick layer of ice. Everyone except for the local guide died. Their skin and mucous membranes began to bleed. Their teeth fell out, and they began to look like ghosts. Listening to this story, the girls were frightened. Yu explained that the tragedy was caused by a terrible disease resulting from a lack of vitamin C. Scurvy. Cartier asked the young man to explain why the guide was the only one who survived. Yu pointed out that the members of this group had been eating fish. Cartier was surprised. Didn't the guide eat that fish? Yu asked if the girls knew the difference between the guide and the group members. Cartier wondered what the difference could be. Maybe they ate different kinds of fish. Yu said he would give them a hint. The guide didn't do anything special, but all the other members of the group did this before eating the fish. Cartier was surprised. What could the other members of the expedition have been doing? The girl asked, "Was the guide really the only one who ate the fish raw?" The young man said that was the correct answer to the quiz, since raw fish is rich in nutrients. Cartier asked how raw fish helps prevent scurvy. He explained that scurvy is caused by a lack of vitamin C. To avoid getting sick, you need to make up for the deficiency. Vitamin C is found in many foods, including fish. Kulala said that the others had eaten fish as well. Yu explained that vitamin C breaks down very easily, even upon contact with air. Cartier suggested that the other members of the expedition had cooked this fish. Yu said that was indeed the case. When heated, vitamin C is almost completely destroyed. In the expedition members' country, it was not customary to eat raw fish. It was always cooked. Due to a lack of vitamins, they all fell ill. In addition, eating salted food over a long period of time also increases the risk of getting sick. Yu added that this was precisely why he ate fish with citrus fruits, as they are rich in vitamin C. This dish turned out to be very nutritious. Cartier recalled that researchers are indeed prone to such illnesses, but she didn't think it would turn out this way. So does cooking destroy the nutrients in food? The young man noted that some ingredients don't lose their vitamins even when cooked. For example, sweet potatoes are rich in nutrients, as are vegetables that can be eaten raw. Even if such foods are fried, vitamin C won't break down significantly. That's why eating raw fish is beneficial. However, we mustn't forget about a balanced diet either. Kulala noted that raw fish usually causes an upset stomach. Why didn't that happen to them? Yu replied that fish is a perishable product. It's important to eat it immediately after catching it. The farther you take it from the water, the more dangerous it becomes to eat. The fish they caught today was properly handled and very fresh. Parasites are often present in fish. They are killed during cooking. But if raw parasites end up in the stomach, it can indeed cause problems. The young man noted that he has a way of telling whether fish is infected or not, so he prepared sashimi from healthy fish. If the girls aren't sure about the quality of the fish, it's better not to eat it raw. Kulala said she understood everything. Yu was talking about those wriggling insects she had seen. Yu confirmed this. If the parasites are removed, the fish is safe to eat. The young man looked at Cartier and wondered, what happened to her? The protagonist wondered why the girl had become so gloomy. The young man decided she must have swallowed a parasite, but that couldn't be since he had checked everything. Cartier said, the writhing parasites, stomach pains. The girl screamed that it was all very disgusting and revolting. Yu asked Cartier to calm down. For the sashimi, he had used perfectly healthy fish and sliced it very thinly to detect any danger, if there was any. Yu agreed that fish can indeed be carriers of parasites. However, parasites aren't necessarily the cause of stomach pain. For example, little evil elves could be the cause. Our hero was talking about bacteria. Yu added that he could swear there were no parasites in that fish. Cartier apologized to the young man for her rudeness. Kulala admitted that it was really delicious and asked for seconds. Cartier was still surprised. Could eating raw fish really be a common practice in some places? The young man said that in fact there were quite a few such places. Sometimes they dip it in soy sauce or eat it with garlic, onion, and ginger. There are many ways to prepare it, and they're all very tasty. Kulala remarked that she would love to try all those ways. Yu promised that if he found the right ingredients, they would definitely give it a try. However, it was late now, and it was time to rest. After the meal, everyone felt sleepy. In the morning, the young man tested his abilities and noticed that he could now jump very high. The protagonist decided that he was becoming less and less like a normal person. It was getting a little dangerous. What would happen next? Yu tested his abilities further and noticed that he could now easily shatter rocks with a single punch. Yu noted that his strength had also increased. His ability now even allowed him to shatter rocks. The food our hero ate here made him stronger. Now he has a strong body, good defense, and the ability to lure prey. The protagonist wondered, if he returned home, would he become the strongest person there? Still, using his abilities here was quite easy. Overjoyed, the young man shouted loudly. Cartier was surprised. What was that sound? Could it really be coming from Yu? The girl saw a strange white creature, as if covered in foam or bubbles. Cartier came closer and realized that it was indeed Yu testing his abilities. However, it looked rather strange. Our hero assumed that this scene really did look ridiculous. No sooner had he thought this than the young man's appearance returned to normal. The guy decided that these bubbles could be used to escape quickly while underwater. However, the bubbles stuck to him, and he hadn't yet figured out how to control this ability. Our hero asked, why was Cartier looking for him? The girl said that Kulala had recovered faster than they'd expected. In 3 days, she'd be back to normal, so they needed to discuss their next steps. Yu agreed that they should return to camp and discuss everything there. Cartier headed for the camp. She didn't want Kulala to wait for them too long. It seemed to the young man that her physical condition was clearly worse than when she first arrived here. What was the matter? At the camp, the young man asked how Kulala was feeling. She was indeed recovering quickly. The girl replied that she was eating well, so her magical power had quickly returned to normal. It was all thanks to the young man. Yu told Kulala that if it weren't for her, he wouldn't have been able to handle that deer and wouldn't have met Cartier. The young man added that something might have happened to Cartier in that case as well. Cartier opened her eyes and apologized. The girl said she had just accidentally fallen asleep. Was someone calling her? You said he wanted to talk to her. What had happened to her? If she wasn't feeling well, maybe she should get some sleep. Cartier replied that she was fine. The young man remarked that if the girl wasn't feeling well, she should admit it. After all, being sick is very bad. If she kept quiet, her illness might get worse, and everyone would have problems. Cartier said she was having trouble sleeping. She didn't want to bother anyone. Last time, she slept well on the day they met. After that, she kept waking up several times a night. Yu apologized. He hadn't realized it was that serious. He hadn't meant to be rude to her. Cartier replied that everything was fine. She thought she could handle it on her own. The young man understood that living in unfamiliar surroundings could indeed affect the quality of one's sleep. The noise, the climate, even a different bed. The girl said it didn't matter. The young man was surprised. Did Cartier really think that sleep problems were trivial? Cartier suggested that it might be because of the bugs. The girl apologized, covered her face with her hand, and added that it really was because of them. She felt embarrassed, but she was genuinely afraid of insects. Caterpillars, termites, beetles. They were all annoying and frightening. She had slept well only on the first day because she was tired, but after that she couldn't. Cartier explained that she constantly felt as if insects were crawling all over her body, and she literally wanted to scream. The young man remarked that she should have mentioned this much earlier. Yu pointed out that there are ways to get rid of insects. Cartier was surprised. Is that even possible? The young man thought for a moment. How many insects are there here? Yu agreed that it was impossible to destroy them all. However, he had a method that could solve her problem. They needed ingredients. They had plenty of time, so they would start looking for them today. Cartier could go with him. Yu promised they wouldn't go far. Kulala could stay here and watch over the house. The girl promised to call out to them if anything happened. During their search, Cartier asked, "What exactly are they looking for?" The young man spotted a plant with large leaves and told his companion that they needed to gather as many as possible. Cartier was surprised. Why did they need them? The protagonist said he was going to build a house. The girl was surprised. Could they really build a house with the tools they had? Yu gave an affirmative answer. Thin twigs would work for them too. They needed to gather as many as possible. You said they would find the rest of the materials elsewhere. As soon as Cartier gathered everything, she could return to camp. Our hero thought that medium-sized tree trunks were needed to build a log house. They were ideal as building material. The protagonist began chopping down trees using his stone axe. You thought that this axe was sturdier than the previous one, and that made the work easier. A considerable number of trees had already been felled. The young man looked around and decided that this should be enough. There was plenty of wood, but it wasn't worth wasting it. The young man thought that if he needed more, he would chop down trees not far from the camp. Yu found vines winding around the rocks like ivy. They could be used as ropes. The Cartier knife proved very handy and easily cut through the vines. Gathering the materials wasn't difficult in itself. The problem was getting everything back to camp. The young man decided he needed to do something that might help. A short while later, our hero was back at camp with a huge pile of logs. The girls were surprised. Why did he need all that? Cartier felt bad that the guy had to carry everything by himself. Why didn't he ask her to help? He replied that it wasn't that hard and added that he would start building as soon as he had a little rest. Kulala asked if she could help with anything. After all, they had gathered so much, and she wanted to contribute too. Yu admitted that help was indeed needed and asked Cartier to bring some leaves. The young man took the leaves and said they needed a little prep work first, just tear them up a bit. The girl admitted that it really wasn't difficult. The young man told her to be careful or she might cut herself. The protagonist felt that his strength had almost fully recovered. To give Cartier a chance to rest, they needed to finish everything before dark. Next, they could move on to the next step. Arrange the leaves in a certain way and secure them with twigs. The top and bottom branches needed to be secured with a vine, and then a few more knots had to be tied. He added that this way, they would create fairly sturdy walls that would protect them from rain, wind, and insects. Cartier said that she and Kulala would take care of everything, and that they understood everything. Kulala said she could cut the vines to the right length. The young man said that in that case, he would leave it to them and take care of the logs himself. You decided that the house should be built in the southwest corner of the camp, since there was a space there that was perfect for it. Several holes need to be dug where the posts will go. Then everything needs to be connected to form a frame. The logs must be securely tied together using vines. You thought that thanks to his increased physical strength, construction was going much faster. Next, you need to make a few lower posts. You need to place the stakes close together, drive them into the ground, and lay a beam on top. The side wall will be ready. After that, you can start laying the deciduous tree trunks. The main thing is not to forget to tie them together securely. Cartier said that Yu was simply amazing. He managed to build a house in such a short time. The young man noted that it was all thanks to the girl's help. Our hero had to admit that his stamina and strength had truly become incredible. It would usually take a person several days to complete such work, but he managed it in a few hours. Now it's time to work on the interior. Small wooden beds were made, since the main goal was protection from mosquitoes. They also arranged stones in the shape of a well to create a place for a fire. They made a door out of the remaining leaves, and the house was ready. Cartier remarked that it was simply amazing. But why would they light a fire inside? Doesn't a fire attract insects? You explained that once the fire went out, its smoke would keep the insects away. Insects hate smoke. Kulala remarked that you knew everything under the sun and was like a walking encyclopedia. Now Cartier would finally be able to get some sleep. Cartier expressed her gratitude to the young man, and you told the girls not to exaggerate his importance. Our hero added that he doesn't know everything. It just seems that way to the girls. You noted that this technique hasn't been used in construction for a long time. He had studied it once because he was curious. Cartier noted that his knowledge had been very useful to them. The young man pointed out that wooden beds aren't very comfortable, so they need to gather some grass or down. The guy added that they could do that tomorrow. It was already late now. It was time to make dinner. They still had some leaves left, and they could use them today. Until that moment, our hero hadn't realized he'd been in this world for 2 weeks. All that time, he'd been trying to survive. Cartier noted that the path here was very difficult, and they needed to be careful since the rocks might be unstable. The girl noticed an iron turtle ahead on their path. She hadn't expected to encounter it here. It was a very powerful beast with excellent reflexes and sharp spikes. They needed to be careful not to get hurt. You thanked his companion for the warning. Could turtles with such quick reflexes really exist? The girl shouted for you to be careful and watch out. The turtle was approaching. The young man replied that there was no need to worry. He was ready for this. Our hero acted quickly and grabbed the turtle by the spikes protruding from its shell. The young man warned the turtle not to move, as it could be dangerous. Cartier ran over and asked if he was okay. Yu replied that he wasn't hurt. If he could handle deer antlers, these spikes were nothing to him. The girl had heard that the meat of these turtles was very hard to eat because of its unpleasant smell. The protagonist suggested that perhaps no one simply knew how to handle these turtles. If cooked properly, it should turn out very tasty. In any case, he needed to check if there were suitable ingredients for tonight's dinner. If this turtle's meat has a distinctive odor, it needs to be thoroughly prepared before cooking. The meat looked perfectly edible. The meat needs to be cut up, rinsed thoroughly, then evenly salted and left to marinate. You can cover the meat with leaves and leave it under a weight for a few hours to keep insects out. However, even this offers no guarantee that the odor will disappear completely. The mountains are rich in various foods, but there are no spices here, so cooking has certain limitations. The young man lacked the seasonings that would be suitable for the perfect sauce. However, a solution is always better than a problem. The protagonist decided he would make the sauce anyway. He needed to gather sweet fruits and squeeze the juice out of them. Cartier said she had gathered everything the young man had asked for. The girl asked if it was possible to make a sauce from fruits and herbs. Yu answered in the affirmative. The herb Cartier gathered is a plant that looks weak but actually has a powerful root system, the glass trap. The moment a leaf is touched, the roots instantly burst from the ground and grab the prey. If the prey is small, it is simply suffocated. If it is large, it will be immobilized until a predator arrives. The rhizome will obtain nutrients either way. The leaves are edible. They taste somewhat like perilla leaves with a hint of prune. The girl expressed a desire to try them. Next, you need to tear the leaves into small pieces and add them to the fruit juice. You need to mix everything thoroughly so that the leaves are fully incorporated into the sauce. Then pour the mixture into the turtle shell and simmer for several hours. It's good that the shell is thick and can withstand high temperatures. The main thing is not to forget to stir so nothing sticks. Once the meat has finished marinating, soak it in cold, clean water for another hour. Then the meat needs to be ground into mince, and you need to add the turtle eggs and the flour kindly provided by the girl. You announced that the preparation was complete. Now we could begin. We need to add a little fat and wait for it to melt. The girls noted that it smelled very fragrant and somehow familiar. The young man remarked that it was the fat from that deer. Finally, it came in handy. The dish looked appetizing. The meatball instantly turned golden brown. You said he hadn't heard that pleasant sound in a long time. The smell of sizzling meat whetted their appetites. You added that thanks to Cartier, they had flour. If you mix the flour with a little water and fry it, it would be delicious too. They would definitely have to try it on the next mission. We remarked that if something goes wrong with cooking, it's better to have something ready-made on hand. Cartier took offense and said she knew how to cook. The young man replied that he had no doubt about that. Fried food cooks pretty quickly, so you have to remember to keep flipping it so it doesn't burn. You need to take out the cooked meatballs so you can fry the others. When everything is ready, leave a little oil in the pan. Add wild onions and sauce. You can also add pepper and mix well. The last and most important step is to add the meatballs and mix everything evenly. The protagonist announced that the turtle meatballs and sweet and sour sauce were ready. Kulala said that the aroma and color were very tempting. Cartier remarked that she had unexpectedly become very hungry. You said they absolutely had to try it so the girls could dig in. Everyone wished each other bon appetit. After tasting it, the young people concluded that the dish turned out simply amazing. Cartier said the meat was tender and juicy, and the flavor was excellent. Kulala remarked that the sauce completely overpowered the smell of the meat. The flavor was very fresh. The young man said that fried food always makes him sleepy. It's very tasty. He's never eaten anything like it. Cartier asked what fried food meant. He explained that it's a cooking method using hot oil in his hometown. This process is called frying. Sometimes the food is fried directly in the pan, and sometimes it's marinated first. Marinated meat is also placed in the pan and fried until done. Chicken pieces and skewers are all very popular dishes. Cartier said she wanted to try all of it. Kulala guessed that it must be delicious. The young man remarked that if he found the right ingredients, he would definitely cook everything. You suggested they continue enjoying the turtle meatballs. After a while, the protagonist declared that he was full. Cartier remarked that every dish the young man made turned out to be very tasty. The girl asked if he would gain new abilities after eating these meatballs. You noted that after eating this dish, he didn't feel anything special yet. The young man noted that most of the time, his abilities lie dormant and only awaken in life-threatening situations. Besides, it's impossible to guess exactly what ability he might gain. You added that he thought he would gain an ability by eating venison, but that didn't happen. In any case, they need to keep observing. Kulala noticed that the turtle was growing spikes. Cartier added that the glass trap also possesses very useful properties. For some reason, the protagonist imagined spikes growing out of his back. No spikes appeared. He couldn't break anything with his foot either. He needed to imagine that his feet were capable of taking root. Again, nothing happened. However, his body began to make suspicious noises. Could it be stomach trouble? Cartier suggested that these might be abilities the young man doesn't need. That's why they aren't manifesting. You noted that the ability to set traps would be quite useful. Perhaps that wasn't the issue. Kulala suggested that they might be using their abilities incorrectly. Maybe they should try combining them. For example, someone should step nearby, and then spikes would spring out of the ground. He replied that there was no point in speculating. They only knew what it might look like. With that knowledge alone, they couldn't activate them. Unexpectedly, Yu said that Kulala might be right. He hadn't even thought that was possible. Cartier noticed that Kulala had suddenly blushed with embarrassment. The girl making excuses said she was just very happy. Yu added that they had to try it anyway. The young man decided he needed to feel the energy in his body. Synthesizing abilities is similar to the process of cooking. There, too, he selects the ingredients most effectively. Yoshiu decided to focus the energy on his fingertips. The young man succeeded. A small plant grew before him. Yu asked the girls how he should test the plant now. Should he throw a rock at it? Cartier suggested throwing a bowl instead. Suddenly, the trap was set. The speed was impressive. Thorns appeared above the plant. You said he had acquired the ability thanks to Kulala. The girl objected and added that she had nothing to do with it. Kulala noted that it had simply popped into her head by chance. Suddenly, a loud roar rang out. The young people were startled and tensed up. You wondered what that sound could mean. Could it really be a real dragon? A dragon did indeed fly overhead. For the young people, the dragon's appearance came as a complete surprise. You could see it on their faces. Cartier was the first to break the silence. The girl said she hadn't thought a dragon actually lived here, so her mission had been worthwhile. You thought that just one glance from the dragon had taken his breath away, but he shouldn't react that way. The young man took a deep breath. It was a good thing the dragon hadn't noticed them. Kulala declared that she couldn't stay here any longer. The girl noted that if she stayed here, everyone would die. You thought that Kulala was right. Dragons are cruel by nature and very protective of their territory. Before there had only been rumors, but now the young man had seen everything with his own eyes. He assumed that the dragon had long considered this forest its territory. Cartier asked how Kulala was feeling now and how her leg was. The girl replied that she wouldn't make it to the village without help. The journey would take several days. Kulala told her friends to leave her there. That way, they would be able to survive. Yu expressed outrage at these words. The young man suggested that Kulala was truly afraid to talk about such things. Cartier decided that now was not the time to be afraid. They needed to gather their strength and calm her down. Yu and Cartier approached Kulala and told her to listen to them. They couldn't do that. They would definitely help her get home no matter what. Cartier added that helping the townspeople was her duty. Leaving friends in trouble was a real insult to knights. Yu noted that the tougher the times, the more united they must be. Cartier added that if they worked together, they could overcome any difficulty. Kulala burst into tears and said she couldn't cook or fight. She would be a burden. You said that wasn't true. After all, the only person who knows the way is Kulala. Cartier added that Kulala is their guide. Only she can save them. The Knight of the Order added that without Kulala, they wouldn't be able to get out. Yu noted that he had become much stronger, so he would be able to carry the girl without any problems. Yu asked Cartier if they could defeat a dragon should they encounter one. The girl replied that it wouldn't be easy. To fight a dragon, they would need at least 5 people with combat experience. Yu suggested in that case taking the road so they wouldn't run into the dragon. Kulala wasn't entirely sure, but she thought the village was in that direction. The girl pointed with her finger. If they could find the right spot, she was ready to plot a more accurate route. The girl pointed in the direction and added that the dragon didn't seem to have flown that way. In open terrain, it might spot them, but it was worth a try. You said that in that case, they would set out in the morning. The young man added that their camp was too conspicuous. They were lucky the dragon had flown past. Cartier added that if they went through the forest, the chance of being spotted would be much smaller. Kulala agreed. You noted that it wouldn't be easy, so the girls should try to get some good rest. The girls replied that the young man should rest as well. They all wished each other good night and sweet dreams. In the morning, the young man woke up. He hadn't been able to sleep well. Thoughts of the dragon kept him awake, for dragons are truly powerful creatures. Yu peeked out of his hut and wished good morning to everyone who was already awake. Cartier said she hadn't been able to sleep either. She'd had nightmares all night long, which kept waking her up. The girl added that unfortunately, there was nothing to be done about it. They needed to set out and find a safe place. Yu expressed hope that everything would work out for them. He asked Cartier to sit with Kulala while he packed their things for the journey. Cartier walked over to the hut and told Kulala it was time to wake up. Our hero wasn't a very emotional person, but he was sad to say goodbye to this camp. After all, this was his first home in another world. What from here might come in handy on the road. The protagonist decided he needed to pack everything into his backpack. He absolutely had to take items from his own world, since there were no equivalents here. Who would have thought that such simple things would become real treasures? He absolutely had to fill his bottles with water. He won't take the axe, the basket, or the rest of the items, since they're unlikely to be needed. Turtle shell can be used as a shield, But will it withstand the dragon's flames? In any case, it's too heavy to carry around. The young man almost forgot the most important thing. The deer hide might just scare off wild animals. It's a little worn, but it'll still come in handy. It gets very cold in the mountains at night. If he can't find shelter, the hide might keep him warm. Yu tried to attach the hide to his backpack using vines. Now all that was left was to gather some dried meat. Our hero pulled out a double-bladed spear made from deer antlers. He had made it himself, but had never used it before. The protagonist didn't know what to call this weapon. However, it looked quite sturdy. The girls gathered and said they were ready too. Yu told them he had packed their bags. Now they could set off. Kulala said she was sad to say goodbye to this house, which she had watched being built right before her eyes. Cartier noticed that she could barely make the bed because she was so sad. The young man understood that the girls felt it would be better to return to the village and sleep in their familiar beds. Now they needed to find high ground to map out their route properly. Cartier offered to carry Kulala for a bit. Yu expressed confidence that they were on the right path. The young man looked back and asked how Cartier was feeling. The girl replied that she was fine. Kulala noted again that it was all her fault. After a while, the young people arrived at their destination. The view was breathtaking. They were surrounded by beauty, but it was a shame they didn't have time to enjoy it. Cartier told Kulala to be careful on the way down. The girl thanked her savior. Yu asked if Kulala could now find her way to the village. Kulala said she needed a little time to look around. The girl pointed in a direction and noted that if they went down that way, they would reach the village. Yu told his companions that they had quite a long way to go. Since they had found the path, now was the perfect time to rest and eat. They told the girl they were all for it. Yu noticed that he still had plenty of dried meat left. Plus, he'd gathered some fruit so they'd have enough to eat. Kulala remarked that this snack looked absolutely delicious. The young man said there was no need to worry about food. Our hero looked into the distance and said that with a view like this, the food tasted even better. The protagonist was curious about what kind of clothes the villagers wore, what their houses were made of, how their society was organized, and whether their way of life differed from what he was used to. The young man was curious about what spices the villagers had, what they used, and which country in this world was considered the culinary capital. Kulala smiled. The girl said that Yu was thinking about food again. He always smiles when he talks or thinks about it. Kulala added that it looked very cute, especially when he was absorbed in cooking. Food is a necessary part of survival, so his passion is quite useful. Cartier agreed. They had survived only because of food. Food made with emotion is the most delicious. The young man said that this was the first time someone hadn't thought his hobby was strange. He was happy. Kulala asked Yu to teach them how to cook once they reached the village. If the villagers tried his food, they would be delighted. Cartier added that they were speaking sincerely, without any flattery. The young man thanked them and added that he would definitely cook for the villagers. The young man noted that they needed to eat and walk a little further before it got dark. As evening approached, they would need to find a place to rest and eat again. The girls agreed. Yu thought his companions would soon be showering him with praise. He was glad to have met such kind people. Suddenly, a huge shadow appeared. A dragon flew overhead. Yu grabbed his weapon and said that danger was coming from above. Yu added that they needed to get ready. Running away was pointless now. They had to defeat the dragon. Cartier agreed. If they ran, they wouldn't stand a chance. The girl added that if the civilian had decided to fight, she, as a knight, simply could not back down. Kulala was frightened because it would take at least 5 warriors to defeat the dragon. Yu pointed out that there were 2 of them, which was almost half the number needed. In any case, they had to fight. The dragon began to descend. A confrontation was inevitable. The young people took up battle positions. Cartier said the dragon hadn't attacked them yet. That was good, but what should they do? You said that he was bigger, so he would try to distract the dragon. The girl pointed out that in that case, he would be in danger. Yu asked if she really had a better idea. Why was the dragon just staring at them and not attacking? She liked the idea of putting civilians in danger, but the young man had indeed suggested a better option. He said everything was fine. In his opinion, he didn't fall under the civilians category. Kulala stood up and began to cast a spell. The girl noted that these were minor details, but she reinforced the wooden hilt of his weapon so it wouldn't break in battle. Kulala wished her friends good luck. Yu agreed that they would definitely need luck right now. Cartier told Kulala to hide somewhere immediately. You needed to get ready. The young man rushed into the attack and said he would distract the dragon. Cartier should attack it from a favorable position. The young man thought that if he distracted the dragon, Cartier would be able to attack with maximum effectiveness. The protagonist used the skills spell and seduction. The dragon was thrown into confusion. White plumes of smoke appeared between the opponents. Yu was indignant. Did the dragon really think that smoke and rocks would stop him? The dragon was indeed clever, but now it would definitely be distracted by him. Yu declared that he wanted to live so he could try lots of delicious food. That's a great reason not to lose. The young man told the dragon to attack him, and then he would see its true power. Cartier looked at her colleague and decided that he was very strong. He was much stronger than previously thought. The girl recalled that once she had teamed up with 5 knights to fight an immature dragon, but even the 5 of them together weren't as good as Yu is now. Yu shouted that they couldn't relax yet because the battle was still ahead. Our hero felt as though the power within his body continued to grow. The dragon accelerated and began closing in on its opponent faster. Our hero didn't think a dragon of that size could be so fast. Fortunately, the young man managed to hold his ground and not lose. The dragon struck with its paw, and our hero blocked the blow by thrusting his weapon forward. The young man thought its paws were too powerful. The dragon attacked again. Yu continued to parry the blows. The girl shouted that she was already running. Cartier leaped high into the air and swung her blade. The girl struck and landed on the ground. The dragon looked in astonishment at his body, at the spot where the sword had left a mark. Cartier decided her strike had been too weak. The dragon remained standing. The girl apologized to the young man. She took aim again, but the dragon was too fast. The wound was shallow and, moreover, healing quickly. You said everything was fine. At least they knew the weapon could hurt him. Moreover, he had thought that dragon's blood was green or purple, but it turned out to be red. Cartier was surprised, as she hadn't expected the young man to be concerned about something like that. The girl said that now was not the time to talk about it. The dragon was clearly furious and began to roar loudly. He shouted for the girl to be careful. At that moment, the dragon tried to attack her. The young man shouted at the dragon not to even think about doing that. He wouldn't let him anyway. Our hero declared that he wanted to eat it as soon as possible. However, the dragon was still wary of Cartier. It was very difficult for the dragon to resist his abilities. It could attack at any moment. The young man decided he needed to make the bait more effective. The dragon caught the scent of meat and turned its gaze toward the young man. The dragon lunged at our hero. The young man decided that now it would definitely chase him. The dragon stepped on the spot where the plant had been, and in that very moment, thorns pierced its paws. The dragon lunged, but the thorns prevented him from moving. He roared loudly. The protagonist thought they had succeeded, but at that very moment, the dragon broke free from the thorns, having only slightly injured its paw. The young man realized that such injuries were nothing to it. Our hero saw fire appear in the dragon's mouth and shouted for Cartier to get out of the way immediately.